Thank you, Jaap. And good morning, everyone. As ever, it is a pleasure and a privilege to deliver this presentation at the 5th Annual Conference of the European Beat Studies Network here in Manchester. John Tytell is the earliest important writer to have fully grasped the Beat generation as a whole, to have identified it as a bona fide literary and cultural phenomenon, and thus to have legitimized it as an academic and scholarly subject. John was the first scholar to teach about the Beats as a professor at the City University of New York at Queens, where he still works today, inspiring a new generation of enthusiasts nearly half a century later. In 1976, John published Naked Angels, a biographical and critical portrait of William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac, the three key figures of the Beat generation. John's pioneering study placed them in the context of preceding American literary movements and illuminated their lives and work. It was what we might call the Big Bang that has led all the way to this very conference and all of our endeavors. In the course of his pioneering research, John sought out all the major members of the Beat generation, other than Kerouac and Neal Cassady: Burroughs, Lucien Carr, Ginsberg, John Cleland Holmes, Herbert Huncke, Joyce Johnson, who was his editor, Peter Orlovsky, Carl Solomon, and others. He got to know many of them very well over long periods and interviewed them intensively. I first met John Tytell very briefly at the Beat Generation Legacy and Celebration Conference at New York University in 1994. He signed my 1991 Grove Weidenfeld trade paper first edition thus of Naked Angels there, and I attended several panels on which he sat. Then just late last year, John contacted me after noticing some of his books being offered on my Third Mind book site. We began corresponding, and I proposed that he allow me to interview him for this presentation. He is, of course, familiar with EBSN, Dr. Oliver Harris, and company, and he happily agreed. In early February, I traveled to New York City and set up headquarters in Greenwich Village at the Marlton Hotel, whose bar Kerouac once frequented. Marlton is also very near John's home, where he has lived since 1967 with his wife Mellon, a noted photographer. Between enjoyable evenings of dining and drinking, we sat down in my suite at the Marlton on a Saturday afternoon for what would prove to be a nearly 4-hour interview. I'd like now to share with you a few of the many anecdotes and insights offered by the earliest and still greatest witness to the Beat generation. John said that he first became intrigued with the Beats when he read Ginsberg's Howl and Kerouac's On the Road while still in high school, when these works were first published. He read Burroughs' Naked Lunch a few years later. As was the case with many young readers then, John was intrigued by the bannings and controversies, by the censorious American establishment, as well as by the famously positive review of On the Road by Gilbert Milstein. As he put it to me, then Naked Lunch comes out 2 years later. Same thing. I want to read that book. If the court says you shouldn't read it, then maybe I should read it. The seed was planted but late to bloom. John pursued his PhD on Henry James, on whose life and work he initially specialized as a graduate assistant and full-fledged professor. But beginning in the late 1960s, he began to review some late Kerouac works, including Vanity of Douloise and other Beat-related books for the Catholic World, Commonweal, and other journals. One thing led to another, and John became the premier writer of articles relating to the Beats. A key early article entitled The Beat Generation and the Continuing American Revolution was published in the prestigious journal The American Scholar in 1973, and it caught the appreciative attention of Ginsberg, who in turn passed it on to Burroughs and others. Soon John was at work on a book-length study under the editorship of Joyce Johnson, Kerouac's memoirist and biographer. One after the other, he surveyed the primary writers of the early Beat generation, most of whom were still alive, some even in their prime. Speaking about a meeting with Herbert Huncke, John said these writers were wary of being interviewed, not trusting academia and the media, whose members were mostly dismissive of them, at least until John came along.
They think they confused me with being a cop. Certainly, well, you see, both Lucien Carr and Herbert Huncke had been prisoners. Herbert more frequently. They were particularly suspicious.
You would say this guy is heat, yes?
Right. Or he was an informer, he was going to tell the cops and they were going to throw me back in jail. Herbert certainly saw me in in the beginning in that way. I mean, there was a whole army of negotiation before I could get him to sit down, and fortunately, I knew a writer, Edward Dahlberg, whose former wife, Arlene, I knew, and she was a key intermediary. She was a friend of Hunky's. And she said, well, you know, you'll meet in my living room. And in those days, she lived right across from the old Stuyvesant High School on 15th Street and First Avenue or something in that neighborhood. And we met there. And I had a way to warm Herbert up and make him, convince him that I was not a cop and that I was not going to entrap him.
Right.
It was against the law, but it didn't matter to me. Since I knew the law is always relative and it changes, and in fact it has, I gave him a joint of some of the most powerful stuff he'd ever smoked. And I smoked it with him, so that he knew. Cop in those days couldn't do that.
Right.
Okay? So that he knew that I was cool. And he opened up, and we had an incredible session. I think that interview is priceless.
We talked about how Hunky coined the term beat. John said, and you know, beat really comes from him. You know, it's his term. It's what he meant. It's something that really grows out of the suffering of the people in a fundamental and phenomenal manner. Very different from Kerouac's later appropriation of the term as conveying beatitude. His description of a meeting with Lucien Carr offers a capsule statement on the very origins, the nucleus of the beat generation.
It's not because of Lucien, but you know, living in that apartment in 1944, shared by these three writers, Burroughs, Kerouac, Ginsberg, and two women, Edie Parker and Joan Vollmer, whose apartment it was, which for her became a fatal attraction,
Yes.
her attraction to Burroughs. She was a married lady with a child. Her husband was in Europe fighting for this country. When she invited Burroughs to join her in her bedroom. You know, the fact that after the murder and the arrest and the sensation in the news, Burroughs and Kerouac decided to collaborate on a fiction in the kitchen of that apartment, that's the beginning of the beat generation.
As it turned out, Carr had taken John out to a loud dive bar, but having become drunk, he was unable to keep up with his subject. His tape recorder also failed to capture the responses to his questions, although they were mostly elusive anyway. John ultimately never did get much out of Carr, but this was made up for by his interviews and conversations with others over many years, especially those of the early 1970s that formed the basis of Naked Angels. John highlighted a keen insight by Kerouac into the beat generation via a critique of John Cleland Holmes, author of Go and an important friend to Kerouac.
He knew Kerouac very, very well, very, very intimately, all of Kerouac's life. Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, Kerouac, you know, Holmes writes that article for the New York Times Magazine announcing this new term, beat generation, in 52.
Yes, this is the,
And that probably, from Kerouac's perspective, was the end of the beat generation.
You're right.
Once he had announced it in that way,
The air, yeah, right.
his hipster secrecy
Right,
was
yeah.
dissipated.
Right.
So for Kerouac, it was over then.
Recalling his first visit to Allen Ginsberg's farm in Cherry Valley, New York, John gave his impressions of Peter Orlovsky, Ginsberg's lifelong companion, and Carl Sullivan, to whom Howl is dedicated. And I quote, "And we come into the house and we meet Peter, and there's Carl, he's there too. He's spending that week there to escape the heat of the city. Allen had invited him generously up. All of Allen's friends were always hanging out at the farm. They would use it as a refuge. And initially that is why Allen had gotten it, not so much for himself but for Peter, who had a predilection for dangerous drugs, mostly amphetamines like methadone. He figured if he could get Peter up on the farm, that would be a better environment for him. And indeed it was. Peter was a natural-born farmer, and as soon as I met him in that kitchen, and he said, 'What do you do?' And I said, 'I teach at Queens College.' And he told me immediately that as a young man in high school, he grew up in Queens, and in high school he used to work after school at the last farm in Queens at what is now our athletic field. So that created an immediate bond which stayed for life. But there was Carl, you see. Subsequently, Carl kind of adopted me as his lay analyst. Carl had a lot of psychic trouble. He was on Thorazine, which was the first of the mind control drugs, and it's a very heavy control phenomenon. And even that couldn't quiet his anxieties at times. I would meet with him once a week and listen to Carl's problems and try to give him some advice. You know, it's not so bad. Look how far you've come. In fact, it's me who got him to write a whole book, and I gave him the title for it. At that time, I was doing more for American book reviews, so I got him some review assignments. And I said, look, we can make this into a book. And out comes Emergency Messages. I found him a publisher too, Ken Stewart. Carl is a very good person, but you know, could have unmanageable outbursts. And I had to suffer some of them, and they were hard for me to take, believe me. When someone is screaming, and it's not your fault, but he's screaming at you, it's kind of hard to take. He would have uncontrollable episodes because of some grief that he felt he had to express. And you know, I tried to be as compassionate as I could. John arranged to interview Burroughs very soon after his return to the USA after a quarter century of expatriate living in early 1974. I mentioned that during this interview, Burroughs had initially denied being a member of the Beat Generation, or even that such a movement existed. John responded insightfully.
Let me say about what William said, you know, denying belonging to the Beat Generation.
Yeah.
Berlinghetti told me this. Gary Snyder told me this. I am sure Jack Kerouac would have told me this. Writers don't want to be categorized. They don't want to belong to groups. Had I asked Hemingway whether he was a member of the Lost Generation, he probably would have hit me.
Right.
Because he was a pugilist. Had I asked Fitzgerald, he would have given me a drink.
Yes.
You know, so I don't blame him for his answer.
Yeah.
However, with each of these men, with Snyder, with Berlinghetti, with Burroughs, too bad. You guys hung out together. You were characters in each other's fictions and poems.
Right.
You know, now it is true what Bill Morgan maintains, that the nucleus, as far as the idea of generation of writers that were in the same corner, the same dark, unknown corner, reviled corner. This is Allen Ginsberg. He's the organizer. Right. He's the press agent. He's going to get people together. He's going to encourage the continuing friendship. Okay? Yeah, I understand Bill Morgan's point, and it's well taken. But nevertheless, it is history. It is history. I mean, if Burroughs agreed to co-write a novel with Jack Kerouac, he's in the Beat Generation whether he likes it or not.
The novel John mentioned is, of course, And the Hippos Were Boiled in Their Tanks, which was finally published recently. During his interview with Burroughs, John also brought up Burroughs' shooting and killing of his wife Joan Vollmer Burroughs in the notorious William Tell incident in Mexico City in 1951. After describing to me this part of their encounter, he then weighed in with his opinion about it, as well as a heretofore unknown related insight regarding Burroughs and Kerouac.
That I did the interview, you said, and he invited me to the bunker, which was 222 Bowery, and I went and did that interview. What I was trying to accomplish in that interview was chronological certainty, because he moved around so much, and he really was the most, at that time, the most obscure figure in that group. And and I wanted to know certain very elementary things that any historian would need to know if you were going to write about a figure. I miscalculated at one point when I asked him to describe the circumstances of the shooting. Okay? I don't think anyone had asked him quite that bluntly before.
You were the first person that we know of.
And upset him. William knew a lot about tape recorders, and he got up and he walked 12 feet away and he began to mumble, and he never mumbled. And his response was, indecipherable, but metaphorically, he's going to shut the door.
Right.
And he did.
Right.
He did. I mean, I saw him subsequently many times, but I knew that I had miscast. That it was my naivete. It was my tactlessness
Yeah.
that had caused this. It was my curiosity, which could not be contained. Yeah, so, you know, Alan's view, which he offered subsequently, is that she was suiciding herself by cop.
Right.
And I think that's a romantic rationalization. Alan has the right to take it. He loved Joan. So did Kerouac. One of the most incriminating things, you know, I maintain in Paradise Outlaws that there was a lifelong rivalry between Kerouac and Burroughs. And I think one of the reasons is that Kerouac slept with Joan in that apartment. Bird collection, the New York Public Library acquired a whole vast trove of Kerouac archive, okay? One of the things I discovered was a little notebook in which Jack Kerouac records the names of the 75 women he had slept with
Black book.
in that period of the 1940s. And Joan's name is
It's
there.
in there. Yeah.
And that's not fiction. That book is not fiction and it's not fantasy. He just lists the names. He tries to remember every girl that he had slept with. Okay? So, yeah, I believe that even though they were lifelong friends, that doesn't mean that
There was some
friends or siblings cannot have rivalries.
Yes.
Okay? And I believe, I suspect that was, you know, possibly the source.
Our discussion turned to the Nova Convention, which took place in New York City in 1978. As I'm sure many of you know, this milestone event featured readings and performances by Burroughs and many others who were influenced by or associated with him, including the avant-garde composer-philosopher John Cage. John confirmed that to our knowledge, this was the only time the two were both present at the same event, albeit separately. I noted how I have always perceived a similarity between Burroughs and Cage. John agreed, going on to make these observations.
Yes, and I think that the reason is that both of them descend from Duchamp, from Marcel Duchamp. You know, I'll give you an instance of this. When I said before that Burroughs was a great actor, and this is what a novelist needs, is to be able to invest him or herself into roles.
Yes.
He, in Gus Van Sant's film Drugstore Cowboy, plays this priest in a role that he could have written for himself. It's so authentically like Burroughs, okay? So he's playing a priest, a drug addict who's been defrocked as a result, is living in an SRO when he meets Johnny Depp. Not Johnny Depp.
Matt Dillon.
Matt Dillon, right. I'm sorry. This reprobate figure, Matt Dillon. And they take a walk together, and Burroughs points to some garbage in the street. He says, you know, this is art.
Yes.
This is Duchamp.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the idea.
Right.
And I think it's a very beat idea.
Yes.
That, you know, you don't have these elite hierarchical distinctions about what constitutes art. You know, it's like that marvelous anecdote that Ginsberg told me. When he first met Burroughs on Bedford Street, Ginsberg, who always has these profound questions, he was always bothering the Buddhists with his questions about reincarnation. I saw this. He was disarming them, and he refused to believe in it, and and he asked Burroughs, "What is art?" And Burroughs' response, because he didn't want to indulge in this bullshit. It's a three-letter word.
It's a three-letter word.
Which of course it is.
Yeah.
But the source of this is Marcel Duchamp, who takes the urinal, puts it in the museum, and says, "This too is art."
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that Cage and Burroughs are related in that sense.
We then discussed the haunting incident that occurred between him and Burroughs in 1982 at the 25th anniversary celebration of On the Road at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. As he recounted in Paradise Outlaws, Parallels, another of his major beat works first published in 1999, which features many iconic photographs by Mellon.
Getting back to good old Burroughs, I
Right.
can't help it. There is a wonderful passage in Paradise Outlaws where Burroughs told you something that really startled you. It was in Boulder in 1982 during the 25th anniversary celebration of On the Road.
Right.
And Burroughs had recently moved out of New York City to Lawrence, Kansas with James Grierhold. When you asked him whether he found Lawrence uninteresting after the stimulation of New York City, he replied, "To us lone cats, all supermarkets are the same." And after pondering this, you realize that his remark, I'm quoting you now, came from a man who inhabited an interior space that ultimately was all that he found interesting.
To us lone cats, all supermarkets look alike. And over time I began to understand that this was probably a profoundly beat perception, because one of the things that the beats, particularly Kerouac, but Burroughs also, were aware of was the consumerist nature of American society after the First World War. And the danger of that consumerism in terms of the ability to perceive, the ability to believe everything that constituted being human. And that this was really very threatening and dangerous.
We talked about his role as a pioneering scholar of the Beat generation. I think you will appreciate his definition of the Beat tradition, which is taken from his description of the course he teaches on it. Quote, "The Beat tradition, a projection of our most idealistic aspirations, as well as an angry, nightmarish view of our mutual failure to meet such expectations," unquote. John went on to reminisce about Burroughs' brief career as a teacher at City College of New York, where he worked just after returning to the USA in 1974.
And Burroughs had been asked to take over a creative writing course by none other than Kurt Vonnegut, who had been doing it. And Burroughs, needing money at that time, having just come back to this country, took the job, and I thought it was, a good idea for me as a former CCNY student, even though I hadn't been an English major, to audit this course. And I asked his permission, and he granted it, and I sat in the back of the room and observed, and thought that he seemed like unlike any of the characters that he had invented, a decorous grandfather. Extremely genteel, extremely ordered, and systematic. As someone who professed to hate intellectuals, he was quite intellectual and theoretical in his approach. He was interested in the cinematic way to use fiction and to represent it in fiction, that cinematic lens. And he was lecturing from notes, and he was quite sober. And then he said in an interview that the students were disappointed in him. They, quote, I'm paraphrasing, they expected me
Wear a strap-on.
Right. Yeah. Like Steely Dan.
Yeah. The foregoing is only a small part of my rich conversation with John Tytell, the foremost founding scholar of the Beat generation. I hope to present much more of it as a publication and/or documentary. John's next book, Beat Transnationalism, will be published soon. Thank you.